It happened in less than 30 seconds. And the room full of ambassadors, generals, church leaders, and old aristocratic hands who had eaten 1,000 state dinners together all felt it. They just could not say what they had seen. One sentence, one look. A glass placed slightly too far from a hand. The quiet, deliberate choreography of a woman who has spent 2 decades learning exactly how much can be said without saying anything at all. And seated across from her, the future queen of the United Kingdom, the woman the country has watched grow into something luminous and royal and steady, absorbed it in silence with her hands folded the way her mother-in-law taught her. And no one said a word. Because when Camilla asserts the room, no one speaks first. Not yet. That is the rule. But it wasn't the rule that broke that evening. Something deeper broke. And Prince William, who had been 3 tables away greeting the head of a visiting African delegation, saw it all in the half-second he looked up. And what he did next is what the rest of this story is really about. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss a single update. Because what you are about to hear changes how you read the next 6 months inside this monarchy. The state banquet in question was not a marginal event. It was one of the 2 or 3 most important ceremonial evenings of the year. White tie, diamonds, the full regalia laid out across the Buckingham Palace ballroom precisely the way it had been laid out for 7 decades. 2 heads of state, a visiting republic's president and his wife. The kind of evening where every frame of body language is a sentence, and every seat is a paragraph. And Kate had been preparing for this particular dinner for weeks. Not the dress, though the dress had been chosen with characteristic discipline and edited several times before approval. The seating, the gift list, the order of arrival, the conversations she had memorized about the visiting president's recent education reforms, and the quiet cultural initiative his wife was leading in her own country. She had wanted it to be warm. She had wanted it to be graceful. She had wanted the photographs the next morning to carry the message that this monarchy still knew how to make a guest feel seen. And that, in fairness, is what she delivered, for almost the entire evening. Until the moment that mattered. The moment came during the dessert course. Tradition holds that during a state banquet's second half, the senior consort rises briefly, moves behind her husband's chair, and performs a small symbolic gesture of service. A poured tea, a folded napkin, sometimes simply a quiet word. It is not protocol. It is softer than protocol. It is more in the category of habit than of regulation. The consort role, in this sense, is the ancient visible heart of the monarchy's domestic life. The woman whose presence beside the king says that the crown still lives in a house with a woman in it. It is not written into law. It is written into expectation. And Camilla had performed that role for years, with the discipline of someone who understood that expectation better than most. That evening, however, something changed. Not the gesture itself, something smaller. Something that would have meant nothing to a careless eye, and that meant everything to an experienced one. As Camilla moved behind the king's chair, she did not pause at Kate's place. In earlier years, the rhythm had been predictable. A beat at William's seat, a beat at Kate's. A quiet acknowledgement that softened the gap between the working consort and the future queen. This time, that beat was missing. Camilla's sweep of the table simply passed the princess's setting as though it were not there. And Kate, who had been mid-conversation with the wife of the visiting president, did not react visibly. She did not flinch. She did not allow her smile to slip. She continued speaking about the education initiative for another 7 or 8 seconds before anyone watching could have guessed anything was wrong. But the woman sitting 2 seats closer to Camilla, a senior member of the royal household staff who has worked state banquets for 19 years, knew precisely what she had seen. Because she had watched Camilla perform that same arc at every banquet going back more than a decade. And the arc was never supposed to skip Kate. Not anymore. Not for the last 2 years. Not since the title adjustments, the precedent shifts, the quiet rewriting of who stands where and on what basis. That's skipping, in the language of ceremonial precedence, the unspoken hierarchy that decides who moves first, who sits where, who is acknowledged when, was not an oversight. Precedence, when you understand it properly, is the operating system of royal life. It is what determines whether someone is treated as central or decorative. And skipping a beat is a message. A short message. An ugly one. It was not received publicly. It was not announced. But for every senior figure in that room who knew the choreography, it had been delivered with absolute precision. And across the room, William felt it before he understood it. Because his wife's posture did not change, but something behind her eyes did. He knew because he has spent 20 years learning how to read her in public. He excused himself from the visiting delegation's table with the practiced grace of a man who has been trained to disappear from a conversation without ever seeming to leave. He moved across the floor, paused at his wife, and placed one hand very briefly on the small of her back. A gesture of presence. A gesture that said, "I saw." And the room appeared to notice nothing at all. The state banquet ended, as state banquets do, on the note of warm diplomatic applause. But the real evening had only just begun. Inside Kensington Palace, William sat with his wife in the private sitting room they use when both of them need a room that no camera will ever know about. And he let her speak first, because that is the part the public rarely sees. They remember the man who acts. They forget the man who listens. And Kate, in her own quiet way, did not tell him what to do. She told him what had happened. Not only the skipped beat, the full evening, the seating arrangement she had been told about 2 weeks earlier and then quietly changed the morning of the banquet without explanation. The protocol officer assigned to brief her on greeting the visiting First Lady, who, at the last minute, had been reassigned to Camilla's household staff instead. The small gift placed at Kate's place setting during pre-banquet preparations that matched the personal aesthetic of the visiting president's wife almost perfectly. A gift Camilla would later be photographed handing over personally during the receiving line, which meant the photograph would be hers, not Kate's. None of these were, individually, anything the press would notice. Together, they were a pattern, a careful one. And Kate had noticed. Because Kate has spent 11 years inside this family learning to read not what people say, but what they choose not to. And what she read that evening was this. Camilla had decided, in some private chamber of her own self, that the next queen would not be allowed to glide into the role unchallenged. That deference, in Camilla's mind, had limits. And this woman, quiet, beloved, brilliant with the public, would learn those limits not through confrontation, but through choreography. It was not a fight. That is the part most people will never understand. It was a rebalancing, a quiet one. And William listened to every word. And when she had finished, he did not promise to fix it that night. He did not promise anything at all. He said something quieter. He said she would never face that room alone again. And she believed him. Then he sat with that silence for another few minutes, The room outside the window had gone dark, and it was in that silence that the shape of what William was going to do began to form. Not as anger, as preparation. The kind of preparation that, in this family, has historically meant more than any announcement. Because to understand what Prince William did next, you have to go back several years. Because this was not the first time. It was not the first message. It was not the first time Camilla's household had moved against Kate in ways that felt, from the outside, almost invisible. And what was different this time was not the violation. It was the audience. State banquets have guests. State banquets have cameras. State banquets have ambassadors and peeresses and old baronets who have eaten 1,000 of these dinners and who understand, at the level of bone, the choreography they are witnessing. The skipping of a beat at Kate's chair was the first message of its kind that had been delivered under full ceremonial lighting. Up to now, every message had been quieter. Side doors, private working lunches, adjustments to access that would not surface in any photograph, but that any working royal would feel. The concert at the Royal Albert Hall last February, where Camilla's household controlled the green room protocol, and Kate was routed through a side entrance that had not been used by a working royal in over 15 years. The early spring garden reception, where the official photographer's brief, tweaked at the last minute, focused the lens on Camilla exclusively during the receiving line. The July hospital visit, where Camilla's communications team had pre-positioned talking points in such a way that Kate's own remarks, planned for weeks, were effectively softened before she could deliver them. None of these had been scandals. None had reached the public. They were the kind of operational moments that exist in the gap between what people see and what working royals know, and had been filed away. Not forgotten, filed. And the difference between forgetting and filing is the difference between a woman who is naive and a woman who is patient. And Kate, whatever else she is patient. So when William heard the full evening from his wife's perspective, he did not hear a single moment. He heard a list. And the list was long enough to no longer be accidental. The decision that William made in the hours after that banquet was not announced publicly. It was not even announced inside the palace for several days, but it was made with the kind of institutional seriousness that only William, of all the working royals, currently wields. He was not reacting to his stepmother. He was restructuring the conditions under which his wife would operate. That is a different kind of action. On the morning of the third day, William summoned 2 people to Kensington Palace. The first was Sir Edward Holton, his principal private secretary. Sir Edward is not a dramatic man. He is a man of schedules, briefings, and the long, quiet labor of keeping the monarchy's calendar coherent. The principal private secretary is, in practical terms, the operational brain of any royal household. The person whose job is to translate intention into movement, and to make sure that no working engagement ever accidentally collides with another working engagement in a way that embarrasses the institution. The role is unglamorous. It is also, occasionally, the most powerful job in the building. Because the man who schedules the future is, in the end, shaping the future. The second person William summoned was Dr. Helen Marsden, who has, for the last 9 years, served as the institutional liaison between Kensington Palace and the office of the Lord Chamberlain, the most senior officer of the royal household, the man responsible for ceremonial protocol at every state event, every official visit, every working royal engagement. The Lord Chamberlain's office, in plain terms, is the place that decides who stands where and on what basis. Not the king, not the consort, not anyone whose name might appear in a newspaper, the Lord Chamberlain's office. And when a future queen's ceremonial position has been quietly undermined over a period of years, the only durable remedy is to engage the Lord Chamberlain's office directly, politely, formally, and with a clarity that leaves no room for reinterpretation. And that is what William instructed. The conversation with Sir Edward was short. William did not want a confrontation at the next state event. He did not want a public statement. He did not want the story amplified. What he wanted was structural. He wanted the protocol for all consort-era banquets, garden parties, state visits, and formal ceremonial occasions to be reviewed in writing, formally documented, and signed off at the level of the Lord Chamberlain himself before being circulated to the relevant households. No more informal adjustments, no more quiet modifications the morning of an event. Precedence, in other words, would not be a matter of household preference going forward. It would be a matter of formal institutional record. And once it was formal institutional record, it could no longer be quietly rewritten in a back office the night before a state dinner. William was not punishing Camilla. He was protecting Kate from a system whose quiet flexibility had been turned, in his view, into a weapon. And the distinction matters, because the monarchy is at its strongest when it operates through procedure, and at its weakest when it operates through preference. And William had just declared procedural supremacy over preference in his own household. The conversation with Dr. Marsden was longer. It contained, in its middle, a phrase that the institutional memory of the palace will hold on to for years. William asked her whether there existed any formal precedent for the consort role being deliberately narrowed through protocol adjustment without the explicit consent of the future sovereign. Dr. Marsden replied with care. Such a precedent did exist, once, in the early part of the previous century, and the consequences at the time had been severe. The previous narrowing had lasted slightly more than 4 years and had contributed, ultimately, to an abdication crisis that reshaped the line of succession. William was not unaware of this. He was not drawing a dramatic parallel. He was, however, reminding the room that these things had happened before and that the monarchy's response had always been to protect the line of succession when it was threatened by private maneuvering inside the royal family. The line of succession is more than a list. It is the constitutional spine of the entire institution. To allow it to be quietly reshaped by household preference is, in the strictest reading, a constitutional question. And William had just drawn the line. 2 days later, the Lord Chamberlain's office received a formal memorandum. It was polite. It was procedurally immaculate. It did not mention Camilla by name. It did not need to. The memorandum requested a comprehensive review of all consort-related protocols across state, ceremonial, and mixed-state events for the previous 3 years, and a written certification that precedent for the Princess of Wales would be brought into full alignment with the formal expectations of her future role. The Prince of Wales, in plain terms, had just informed the Lord Chamberlain that his wife was no longer negotiating her own position. He was doing it for her. Through the institutional channel that could not be rerouted, dismissed, or quietly amended by another household the night before a dinner. And then, on the morning of the 5th day, something else happened. And this is the part of the story that almost no one outside the palace will see. William called Highgrove himself. He did not ask his principal private secretary to make the call. He did not let it go through aides. He called his father directly. and the conversation between the two men lasted 11 minutes. Sources close to both households describe it as calm. Neither raised his voice. Neither mentioned Camilla by name. Charles listened to his son's account of the banquet and of the institutional response he had already authorized. And when Charles responded, his words were very few. He told his son that he supported the procedural review. He told his son that any further quiet adjustments to Kate's ceremonial position would require his personal awareness. And he told his son that he had, that evening, already spoken privately with Camilla about the broader pattern. And he did not tell his son what Camilla had said. Charles has spent his entire reign until this point walking the tightrope between his wife and his heir. He has done it with a discipline that the public rarely appreciates, because the public does not see the rope. The king has responsibilities he cannot delegate. The husband has loyalties he cannot betray. The father has a future he cannot compromise. And on the evening of the banquet at Buckingham Palace, all three of those pressures came into the same room. And Charles had chosen the throne. Not his wife, not tradition, the throne. And that is a choice no member of the royal family makes lightly, because it is a choice that, in this family, has consequences that last for generations. The story broke into the public sphere 4 days later, in the form it always breaks into the public sphere. Not from the palace. From a leak so well calibrated, it could have come from a communications strategy playbook, if one existed for this family, which it does not, because this family does not have a playbook. A journalist from one of the major national newspapers called the press office and asked, with the kind of precise specificity that confirms an inside source, whether the Prince of Wales had formally requested a review of consort-era protocol at the Lord Chamberlain's office. The press office gave its standard line, neither confirmed nor denied. Measured language. Polite non-response. The kind of answer designed to close a conversation, and which instead always opens one. By the next morning, the story had a small column on page 6. No names explicitly, no quotes attributed. But the language of the column was unmistakably informed. Consort-era protocol. State banquet choreography. Princess of Wales ceremonial position. The reading public, who are not fools, did the reading public's job. They connected the dots. They filled the gaps. And the commentariat, which has been waiting for years for an excuse to write seriously about this kind of internal palace tension, did not miss the moment. 3 senior royal commentators appeared on the morning broadcasts not with facts, but with interpretation. They read what had happened as a quiet victory for the Prince of Wales. They read it as a warning from the heir to the consort. They read it as the first public indication in over a decade that the working royal order was being formally recalibrated to accommodate a future in which Kate would not be a supporting figure, but the central one. The palace did not challenge any of those readings, nor did it confirm them. And silence, in this family, has always done more talking than any prepared statement. And the public reaction was not angry. It was not outraged. It was something stranger. It was relieved. Because the British public has spent the better part of 2 decades watching Kate absorb pressure with a smile so composed that many viewers had quietly wondered, especially after the difficult first years, what was happening behind it. And now they were being told, in a language they could read without being told what it meant, that something was being done, and that William was doing it, and that the institution had moved on their behalf. And the mood of the commentariat shifted noticeably inside 24 hours. Not toward sympathy for Camilla, not against Camilla, exactly, because Camilla has built a kind of grudging acceptance over 20 years that does not collapse easily, but toward the recognition that precedent in this monarchy is not folklore. It is constitutional structure. And constitutional structure cannot be quietly reoriented because someone at one end of the table decided on one particular evening to skip a beat. Within a week of the leak, the Lord Chamberlain's office had begun work on what insiders were calling the Consolidated Consort Protocol. A full document, more than 60 pages in draft form, covering every conceivable ceremonial situation in which the Princess of Wales might appear during the transition from her current role to her future one. Where she would stand, in what order she would be received, which gifts she would present, which guests she would greet, in which rooms she would enter, and through which doors. The document was not designed to elevate Kate artificially. It was designed to eliminate the small private adjustments that had, over the previous 3 years, been quietly narrowing her space.
And in doing so, it put the operational future of the consort role itself into formal review. Because if Kate's position was being codified, Camilla's position had to be codified alongside it. Not in opposition, in parallel. Because that is how constitutional monarchy works. One half cannot be redesigned without the other being acknowledged. And by the time the Consolidated Consort Protocol is finalized and signed off, perhaps sometime in the autumn, the institutional language of consort role will be cleaner than it has been in 20 years. Not because anyone wished to diminish Camilla, because the monarchy, when it is operating well, does not allow private resentment between households to become constitutional drift. The symbolic moment that captured the public's attention came 11 days after the banquet, a garden party at Buckingham Palace. Not the controversial one. The follow-up, a smaller, more deliberately composed event, the kind of afternoon event at which the royal family appears for an hour, makes broad symbolic gestures toward continuity, and leaves. And what mattered on this particular afternoon was the geometry of arrival. Kate arrived alongside William, not behind him, alongside him. The two of them moved through the receiving line together, greeted guests together, paused for photographs together. And for one brief moment during the speeches, Charles and Camilla were positioned to one side, and William and Kate to the other. 4 royals, 2 couples, each on their own platform, each clearly visible, each clearly central. And that was not accidental. That was the Prince of Wales demonstrating, in the only language the monarchy understands without ambiguity, that the future structure of the family was no longer in negotiation. And the country understood, because the country has been waiting, sometimes without knowing it, for this kind of quiet certainty. Not because of drama, because the alternative was a slow institutional drift that had already gone on long enough. And William, 3 tables away from his wife on the night of the banquet, had felt that drift in his own hands. What the country saw over the following weeks was not a confrontation between William and Camilla. The country does not see private conversations between heirs and their fathers. The country does not see Lord Chamberlain memoranda. The country does not see the 11-minute phone call between king and prince. What the country saw was a shift, subtle, cumulative, in the arrangement of state events, in the photographic record, in the prominence of Kate's ceremonial positioning, in the language used by official royal communications in describing the princess's role at events. None of it was loud. All of it was durable. And that was the point. Because the monarchy does not argue, it arranges. And what William arranged, beginning on the night of that state banquet, was a future in which his wife could step into her role
without first having to step around anyone. That is the meaning of an immediate response from a future king. Not a dramatic one, not a public one, an institutional one. So how does this story end? It ends not in one place, but in two. The first is institutional. The Lord Chamberlain's review will be completed. The Consolidated Consort Protocol will be signed and circulated, and from the autumn onward, consort-era ceremonial will operate under explicit, documented, formal precedent that no household will be able to quietly amend at the last minute. And Camilla, who has spent 20 years building the position she now holds, will continue to hold it. Because that was not what this moment was about. It was about protecting the line of succession against the slow, deep undermining of institutional clarity. And the monarchy cannot survive, in any era, the slow undermining of its own clarity. The second ending is private, and this is the moment the public will never see. It happened 6 weeks later, in a small room at Sandringham. Kate and William, the fire low. Catherine holding a letter in her hand. Not from the palace, from William. 3 lines, handwritten, not on palace stationery, on the kind of paper that lives in desks, not institutions. And she read it in silence. And she folded it once and kept it. And no one will ever see what was written. And that is how it should be. Because there are some things inside this family that the institution does not get to hold. And the most private moment between a husband and a wife, after he has publicly, quietly, structurally defended her against the only household powerful enough to challenge her standing, that is one of them. And what stays with the viewer, in the end, is not the humiliation. The humiliation lasted a single beat of a single evening. What stays is the response. The careful, institutional response of a man who understood that the monarchy's strength does not lie in retaliation. It lies in structure. And that the best way to protect the woman he loves was not to make a fuss. It was to make sure she could never again be moved by one. The monarchy chose preparation over confrontation. It chose procedure over preference. It chose clarity over quiet. And the family remained difficult, still complicated, still haunted by the long history that runs underneath it. But the institution held. The line held. And the future queen was protected not by a press release, but by a memorandum whose details will outlast everyone who reads them. Because that is how kings are made. Not in moments of spectacle, in hours of preparation. And the next time the cameras roll, the country will see 4 people on a platform. And they will look like a family that has decided, finally, with all its imperial and emotional weight, that the institution is bigger than any one of them. And they will be right. Thanks for watching. Please do not forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.